distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jag Humar, and I have the privilege to be your host this evening or this afternoon. And thank you for being present in this evening as we celebrate the legacy of John Adjeleian in a way that he would have most admired through a lecture by a distinguished scholar and engineer, John, who is with us today. I'm going to take a few minutes to describe John's legacy and what John stood for, and after that we'll have an introduction of the speaker and we'll begin there. So as I said earlier, this lecture series is our way of celebrating the legacy of Dr. John Adjeleian. I had the privilege of knowing John and working with him from 1975 until he passed away in 2004. John was that rare person who combined the qualities of intellect, creativity, leadership, humility, compassion, and kindness. He touched the hearts and minds of many, and those of us who knew him were blessed in many ways. This is the 14th year that we are holding this lecture. Each year, I get the privilege of speaking about John's legacy and the contribution he made to his profession and to the society. And it fills me with awe, but also with pride. After earning a bachelor's degree in engineering, civil engineering rather, in 1952 from McGill University, and an MASc in structural engineering from MIT in 1955, John returned to Canada and set up a structural consulting firm in Ottawa. His firm quickly established a reputation in the city and outside. Over the years, it has provided structural consultancy for a large number of diverse structures, some of which become recognized as outstanding examples of architectural and structural innovation. And these included the Fathers of Confederation building in Charlottetown, the National Arts Center in Ottawa, which has now undergone a facelift, the Aviation Museum of Ottawa, and the Sky Dome, known as the Rogers Center these days, but originally called the Sky Dome of Toronto. These were structures that John was most proud of. But John's firm has designed a majority of buildings on this campus, starting from the Tory building to the Canal building and many of the residences, the Minto Case building, and so on. John joined the then Department of Civil Engineering at Carleton University in 1975. He served as the chairman of the department from 1976 until 1982. Now, in 1975, 4 of us joined the department together. There is John Adjeleian, Patrick Salvadorai, who is here, Juan Salinas, who is also present, Gil Hartley, who is also here with his wife, and myself, the so-called Gang of 4. And we are still around, continue to be associated with Carleton University. So for 6 years, John served as the chairman of the department, and then he took retirement in 1982 and was appointed as Emeritus Professor. During his tenure as chair, he established the department as a center of excellence in teaching and research in the field of engineering. And I'm proud to say that the department has grown since then, has made 2 new strides, and achieved new heights. John was a visionary with a unique ability to visualize how a structural form will work in harmony with the architecture of the building. He encouraged teamwork that brought engineers and architects together. And of the many honors he received, John was most proud of his honorary membership in the Ontario Association of Architects. In fact, he regularly taught in the School of Architecture while he was at Carleton. The John Adjeleian Lecture has been established to celebrate the standard of excellence exemplified by John, and lectures in the series highlight the outstanding achievements in professional practice, education, and research that have advanced the field of civil engineering. It is our way of celebrating the professional achievement of John, and it's a special privilege that we have one of the leading lights in our profession to deliver the lecture of 2018. Over the years, we have had some very distinguished engineers, researchers, and construction workers who have talked about John's work and about what he liked. So let me at this time invite the chair of the Department of Civil Engineering, Professor Paul Van Giel, to welcome you on behalf of the department and to introduce our distinguished speaker. Paul.
Thank you, Jag. Well, on behalf of the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, this is one of my best jobs, or tasks that I have to do, and that is to welcome you to our annual John Adjeleian Lecture Series. This is the event of the year for our department. It's a chance for us to recognize some of the accomplishments of the department, both in terms of faculty and staff and students. So on behalf of the department, welcome to Mrs. Adjeleian and the Adjeleian family. Thank you to the Dean of Engineering and Design, Dr. Freda Fogg, for joining us. I'll be introducing John in a moment, but thank you for accepting our invitation. So I usually use this opportunity to highlight some of the things that have gone on in the past year in terms of excellence that's occurred in our department. So I'll start with faculty. We've grown in numbers in the past decade. We've probably grown by 7 or 8 faculty members. And that leads to more and more awards every year. Normally I kind of do this off the cuff, but I had actually to write some notes down because it's getting to be quite a list. But Mario Santana was awarded an honorary doctorate at the University of Liège in Belgium. Scott Bucking was awarded a Teaching Achievement Award. Halim Abdel Halim should be given an award in perseverance because over 20 years ago he developed the Amir roller. And it's gone through different stages, but in this past year, he's teamed up with Tomlinson, and he was probably in the news more than most of us with CBC and CTV, talking about how he's going to solve the problem with potholes. Liam O'Brien won the Building Envelope Council Rising Star. We launched our Global Water Institute, and a couple of years ago we were awarded a large CFI, and Jeff Orozco and David Lau are in the process of transforming our Adjeleian Structures Lab into another level of world-class facility with the equipment that we've put in there. And last year, and when I go to the Civil Engineering Chairs Heads meeting, I kind of discussed this, but last year I told you that there was the NSERC Discovery Grant competition, and the success rate is usually between 60 and 70%. And last year we had reported that for 4 years in a row we had a 100% success rate. I'm sorry to tell you that this year I'm reporting that for the 5th year in a row we've had a 100% success rate in that competition. So that speaks, I think, volumes to the quality of the faculty and how hard they work in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. In terms of students, they equal us in their achievements, and later on we're going to recognize a lot of our graduate students. But in terms of our undergrad students and graduate students, there's an annual competition at the PEO night, and typically Carleton puts forward 2 teams and the University of Ottawa puts forward 2 teams. It just so happens that both teams from Carleton this year are from our department, and it just so happens that we won the competition this year and took home the Tom Folks Trophy. Every year there's a Mike Shefflin Award that looks at municipal engineering and other areas. Again, a Carleton team versus an Ottawa U team. Our team took home the Mike Shefflin Award. Last year, there's the Association of Preservation Technology, or APT, and with our new program, Architecture, Conservation, and Sustainability, we've entered teams. A couple of years ago, we were one of the top 3 or 4 teams and invited to San Antonio. Last year, I think the conference was here in Ottawa, and we won the award in terms of the best student masonry arch competition. And this year again, we were selected as one of the final entries of 3 or 4 teams that are participating in Buffalo. And we've had numerous student paper awards and faculty paper awards, but another thing that kind of stands out is Brandon Robinson is a graduate student in Civil and Environmental Engineering, and NSERC hosts an award for the best video. It's called the Science Action Video, where you have to, in a very short video, explain in simple terms what you do for research. And Brandon actually won, it's a national competition, and Brandon won 2nd prize for explaining viscoelasticity and the vibration of bridges and buildings. So not an easy task, but he did an excellent job in doing so. So that's just a sample of the excellence that some of our students have displayed. The last thing I want to talk to you about is student experience. One of the things that I've been very passionate about as chair of the department is trying to enhance student experience on campus. And so in the past fall, we had 2 C engineering tours. So C stands for student experience and engagement. So the students went out to Mattamy Homes and were in the field there at one of their sites and learned everything from land acquisition to permitting to engineering to sales and marketing, and then we're out in the field looking at the installation of roadways and sewer systems, etc. And we also had another C engineering tour at Tomlinson for the waste recovery facility on Carp Road. Okay, both were well attended by the students, and I think the students thoroughly enjoy going. I went to the waste recovery facility because that's my area of research, and it's a lot of work to organize these events, but when every student comes off the bus shaking your hand and thanking you for organizing a tour like that, it's well worth it. In the spring, or not spring, in the winter, in January and February, we had 3 career panels and opportunities. So we had a panel for civil engineering, a panel for environmental engineering, and a panel for architectural conservation and sustainability, attended by 80 to 90 students. Again, another great success. We fund our students to go to the concrete toboggan race, to the Troitsky Bridge competition, to attend the Civil Engineering Society 4th year capstone design project competition, which again, Carleton, it's a national competition, and Carleton has won twice in the last 6 years, I believe, since that competition started. So our students continue to do very well. We send them on some field trips because that's an important part of their experience, is to interact with industry. And so actually in our 4th year capstone design projects, over half of them have industry mentors. And that's all funded through our Civil and Environmental Engineering Student Experience Fund, which is an endowed fund that the department started about 6 years ago. We're up to about $180,000 in that endowed fund, with another $100,000 committed in terms of donations and matching funds that's yet to come in. So with that, we've been able to enhance our student experience and enhance student life here on campus, and I think it's well worth it, and I thank many of you that are here that have made donations to that fund, and I think the students really appreciate all those efforts, and they continue to excel when we send them on these competitions. So I think I've been now chair in the department for 8 years, with a sabbatical stuck in between there, and our department has really grown and expanded both in our undergrad student body and our graduate student body. And I think we're firing on all cylinders, as the saying goes, but it's not without the tireless effort of my colleagues in the department, faculty, staff, working tremendously hard with the additional load of students and activities and graduate attributes and all these things that we do. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of the colleagues, all my colleagues in the department that work so hard, and to thank our students for working so hard and getting all of these awards. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce to you today today's speaker. John Campbell is the principal at Renova Advisory Services, a consulting firm that is focused on the revitalization of urban areas. Until the fall of 2015, he was the president and chief executive officer of Waterfront Toronto, and was responsible for leading an estimated $35 billion revitalization project of Toronto's long-neglected waterfront. In the past decade, Waterfront Toronto has invested over $1 billion in infrastructure and flood protection, leading to the development of several thousand residential units and creating 24 new or revitalized parks and public spaces. Waterfront Toronto's investments have spurred over $13 billion of private sector investment in the waterfront and adjacent lands. Before joining Waterfront Toronto in April of 2003, John was a senior executive at Brookfield Properties and played a leadership role in the development of that company's Canadian property holdings, including one of their most prestigious, which is the Brookfield Place. John has an MBA from the University of Toronto, but more importantly, he has a bachelor's degree from Carleton University. And he has played a leadership, and he has his Institute of Corporate Directors designation. He is on the board of directors of Artscape, providing creative live and work environments for the arts community, and the board of directors of the Canadian Urban Institute, a leading thought leader in urban issues. In 2012, he was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in recognition of his contributions to Canada. So it's great to have an alumnus giving the John Adjeleian Lecture this year, and such a distinguished alumnus in John Campbell. We did have a feature article on John in one of our publications, and I took a quick look at that, and I pulled out this quote. Campbell also has a message for current students at Carleton. In your career, follow your heart, he says. In order to do well and succeed, you have to like what you're doing. If you're going to spend a lot of time doing something, it's extremely important that it's something that you enjoy, end quote. And I met John a few years ago, and I met him at his office, and he actually had not the presentation that he has today, but a short presentation that he had done all this work for an audience of 2. Jen and I were there, and you could see that he's very passionate about what he does and the impacts it has. So with that, I would like to thank again John for accepting our invitation and to be the John Adjeleian Lecturer for this year, and I'll turn the floor over to John.
Am I on, Ethan? Perfect, I can hear myself. Thank you, Paul, for that kind of introduction. I also want to thank you, the faculty, and say what an honor it is to be invited to be the guest lecturer for the Adjeleian series of lectures. And I appreciate the fact that the family is here as well, so I am quite honored to be asked to deliver the lecture. I'm going to ask a favor of you, because I know Canadians have 2 biases or 2 pastimes almost. We'd love to hate our banks, and if you're not from Toronto, you love to hate Toronto. So I'm going to ask you to put that second bias away for an hour, please. Ottawa's a great city, I love it too, but Toronto's also good. So I want to have you forget that for a minute, that it's that bias. It is a global city. It's about 2.5 million people in the city proper, about 5 million in the Greater Toronto Area, and 8+ million in the larger urban catchment area. It is now the 4th largest urban area in North America, after Mexico, New York, Los Angeles, and now Toronto. We passed Chicago recently as far as population, and it's growing fast. We take in about 100 to 110,000 migrants into the city, or into the city urban area every year. City of London takes 88,000, so it's a fast-growing city. About 50 some odd percent are not born in Canada. We also get about 40% of Canada's national immigration. So if there's, I think, 330,000 projected for this coming year, nationally, we'll get about 40% of that coming to the Toronto and environ. There's about 240 ethnic groups speaking over 140 languages now, and I was at a seminar recently with Richard Florida, and he mentioned if you include dialects, multiply that by 2.5. So it's a very cosmopolitan, very diverse city. Quite interesting, it's fast growing. But what's interesting from an industrial or an economic viewpoint is it's a great base of operations for international companies. So we're within a 1-day truck drive or a 1 to 1.5 hour flight of a market catchment area of about 135 million people, which is great. Now, I'm presuming NAFTA is maintained. I can't speak for what would happen if NAFTA doesn't get renewed, but that's a huge advantage for companies coming from overseas to locate in Toronto, where the talent pool is and the diversity is, but still have access to that size market. But for a city on the lake, I mean, we're not certainly renowned for our waterfront, and it's been pretty grim. Going back, the first plans were done in 1793 by Lieutenant Governor John Simcoe. And there's been plans by the dozen since then, but not much happening. And you can see here most of the land now has been infill with fill from various places as it's grown. And it's still even now separated from the waterfront by a major rail corridor and of course the Gardiner Expressway. So it's still been a problem for quite some time. However, back in the late 90s, Toronto made a bid for the 2008 Olympics. And as a result of that bid, each government, the city, the province, and the federal government, each committed to invest $500 million into the waterfront to make it an Olympic site. Well, we didn't win the Olympics, obviously, but the governments were convinced to maintain that commitment. So $500 million from each government, along with control of government land in the area, which I'll show you, which is about 85% government owned. So that was kind of the contribution towards waterfront revitalization and establishing Waterfront Toronto, or what it was known then was the Toronto Waterfront Revitalization Corporation. That was the legal name. Created that from the three governments to actually make it happen. And we got those commitments. So we are engaged in one of the most significant city building projects in the world. Paul mentioned it's about 2,000 acres, about $35 billion of total investment, both public and private investment. It's going to take 20, 30, 40 years. I'm not sure how long it'll take. It's going to take a long time. I would ask you to get your bearings here, because I'm going to talk about some of these locations. The Central Waterfront, East Bayfront, West Donlands, and the Portlands. And this is the Toronto Islands and Ontario Places over here. So this is all 2,000 acres in close proximity to the central business district of what essentially is the economic capital of the country. So let's give you a scale of the size of this project. I have a diagram here that shows the size of Battery Park. And most people are familiar with the New York City project. 100 acres. Canary Wharf, London, about 300 acres. Waterfront Toronto, 2,000 acres. Most people just don't realize how large the land is. This is going to take a long time and a lot of investment. So challenges? Well, we've had 200 years of studies and not much has happened. We had a small start in the Harbourfront Centre, but then that sort of went off the rails. So the huge buildup of public cynicism, kind of, when we were announced, it was sort of, oh yeah, here we go again, more money for studies and nothing's going to happen. Well, stop and start. I mentioned Harbourfront Centre. That was seen as an initial start, but it sort of ran foul. The government, basically, federal government, basically gave them the land, but then they cut off the funding, so they started selling the land to feed themselves. And that didn't work too well. And we had some pretty poor developers at the time working on it. Complex projects. We're in fill. There's no bearing capacity whatsoever. Put a light pole in, it's on a 35-foot caisson down to the bedrock. I mean, this land here has been there 100 years. The land north of Front Street's been there 10,000 years. So it's very, very expensive to do anything in this particular area. So no bearing capacity, and of course the water table is at about 4 feet. So any kind of excavation is incredibly expensive. Parking garages would cost probably underground, roughly in good soil, maybe $40,000 a stall, $100,000 a stall down here. So it's very expensive and very complex. Also, we know there's global competition. Every city around the world is doing this kind of thing. I mean, we're late into the game. So we know there's global competition, and we know there are limited resources. I mean, $1.5 billion sounds like a lot of money, and it is. But against a $35 billion total investment, it's still limited. And here's the slide I always show because I always want to make this point. Waterfront revitalization versus development. It's not redevelopment. Yes, we're using real estate economics to drive the engine. But really, it's about providing affordable housing, quality of life, great parks and public realm, because that's what makes great cities, is the public realm. Providing transit. It's really about building a quality of life that allows us to attract the talent and retain the talent that'll make us competitive for the next century. It's what I call the economic long game. If we can make a quality of life here, we'll do well, the city will do well, the province will do well, and the country will do well. So that's kind of where I call the economic long game. The business model of this is we have $1.5 billion of commitments from the governments, plus the land. So the business model is to use that seed capital, build infrastructure, pipes and so forth, sell land through an RFP process to the private sector to develop, take the profits from that, reinvest in pipe and infrastructure and so on and so forth, sell the next piece, and move on and on and on, like a revolving line of credit. And that has been working. But that's kind of the model, is to make sure, in fact, we use the proceeds that are generated by the seed capital to, again, advance the investment and advance the model. So our role really is to be the master planners and lead developer for the waterfront. And we do that through basically a number of processes, but I think one of the most important ones is basically consulting with the public. And I don't think you can get away these days without doing that. In the world of social media, every voice has to be heard, and it's critical to bring the public in to collaborate with you as you're making these plans for new communities. I mean, the reality is there's no occupants there today, but you involve the neighbors around you, the various communities, to try and ensure that what you're doing is going to fit with the community. Now, it doesn't mean that's sort of pick up stakes. We have focus, we have vision, we want to make sure we go to a certain end, but we bring the public in. I call it almost like crowdfunding ideas. You bring those people in. In a 5-year period, we had 300 public and stakeholder meetings. Now, we had so many projects on the go and so many series of meetings for each project, it totaled 300 in a 5-year period. So that's almost like one a week. It's very time consuming, but great input. And that generated huge support from the public. They saw us as the public steward, not as some government agency trying to ram something down. We were working and doing projects with the people, not to the people. And so that really was a great help to us politically later on. We know we want to create great quality of place. That's key. And I think that's where I sort of, in reading up on Mr. Adjeleian's history, I saw that was something that he wanted to do, was really combine the ethics, beauty, and infrastructure. And it's critical. So what we've done here is trying to do that. We have some of the world's best design minds that we've brought in to do this. We've won over 60 design awards, and that's when I lost count in 2015. So we've got a humongous number of design awards for things like this wave deck and other things. And we've also invite talent from around the world. Now we know that to practice architecture, we have to be licensed in Ontario, but we bring in some of the talent around the world to partner with local architects and designers to provide the best of ideas from around the world. So this shows, by example, this was the response to an RFP we held for a design competition to design the central waterfront. We had 38 submissions from 17 countries, and we eventually settled with West 8 as being the primary designer. They're a leading landscape architecture firm from Rotterdam, but very important. We also constructed Canada's third design review panel. Vancouver had one, the NCC has one, and we created the third one for Waterfront Toronto, where all the designs are passed through a review panel, and we invite architects, planners, engineers, sustainability experts to sit on the panel to help critique those plans as they come through. And that's an essential element for anyone who's going to work on the waterfront. They have to pass muster with the design review panel, because we want great design. Not just good design, we want great design. We also realized that if we're in control of 2,000 acres of land, and that's, when you think about it, that's room for about 40,000 residential units, so a population of 100,000, let's say, people, 40,000 jobs. We had a bigger responsibility, not just to act as a developer, but really to look at public policy and how do we ensure that we're building a sustainable city. So we wanted to raise the bar for sustainability. So back in 2005, at the very start, we created what we called our sustainability framework. And this was designed to help us, our contractors, our planners, our designers, really to use that to think about how they both design, build, operate, everything that's going to go on the waterfront. So we created a roadmap, 11 areas of our targets, objectives, and so forth. And everything that we do then corresponds to that sustainability framework. Now that was started in 2005, so things have moved on. In fact, in 2005, we used LEED Gold as the standard, and everybody thought we were nuts. It's going to cost you $10, $15 a square foot. But realistically, things have moved on, and so it's not that big an issue anymore. The price premium isn't that great. But it evolved into things like what we call our minimum green building requirements. So as we go to the marketplace and put land out to developers to bid on, they have to sign a development agreement with us. They just don't get the land and then do what they want with it. They sign a development agreement with the corporation, and that controls how they do things. And so, for example, if they buy land through Waterfront Toronto to build on, they have to comply with our minimum green building requirements. And so we've got criteria there of all sorts to talk about, LEED Gold, smart buildings, green roofs, and so forth. And that really dictates how they can build their buildings. So, for example, LEED Gold, we want water efficient landscaping, so no potable water use for landscaping. Water use reduction, you want to reduce potable use by about 50%. Optimize energy efficiency, be 50% below the national model. Put about 3% of renewable energy in every building. And that's just a start. And we'll make sure we can measure and verify after a year. We also, look at what's coming in so far as vehicular use. And I guess some of our community constituents to say, well, make it car-free. Well, that's great for 20 years from now, but what about tomorrow morning? So part of the challenge in doing any project like this is trying to figure out how to plan for the future, but also look after tomorrow morning and make sure that what you're building is not out of the marketplace. So that's always been a challenge. So for example, here, we asked for 2% of the parking spots to be wired up with EV infrastructure, but also 100% to be the raceways and conduits to be there for future wiring. We look at green roof coverage, and they have to provide 50%, or if the City of Toronto bylaw calls for more, they have to put more in. And that really is to ensure that we can control stormwater runoff in the future. Some of the things that from an engineering point of view are interesting is that we've said that we want certain things done a certain way. For example, in Toronto, in the marketplace, people build condominiums, and developers do a great job of building what sells tomorrow. But what sells tomorrow is 500 square foot units. Well, what happens in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time? You're building a slum for the future. So we said if you buy land from us and you build a condo, you can't use the demising walls as shear walls. You've got to build it like an office building. Because in an office building, the floor gets redemised all the time as tenants come in and out. So we want to ensure that, in fact, people who buy a 500 square foot unit can buy their neighbor in the future or their neighbor's neighbor, and you can actually redemise those units to larger units as family sizes grow, because we know that you can't always have people sort of buy here and then move to the burbs and back in afterwards. So we want to make sure that people can actually live and raise their families in a downtown location. So we want to use a column and slab type structure for the residential, and that's not a big deal. They do it in Montreal, but not in Toronto. It's just a market condition. I always quote a good example. If you were building a high-rise building in New York versus Toronto, in New York it would always be structural steel. In Toronto it's always reinforced concrete. Why? Just because. Because it's the market. That's what the trades are used to, the suppliers are used to it, designers are used to it. That's what happens. And so the same thing happens here. I mean, we just have to get them used to building them without shear walls. You can still use masonry walls for demising if you want, but it can't be used as a shear wall. So that's part of the challenge, in looking at how do you plan for the long-term future and still look after tomorrow morning. We also said if you're going to build a parking garage above grade, it has to have certain slab-to-slab heights, ground floor 5 meters, slab-to-slab 2.75 meters above, because we know that in 20 to 30 years' time, when autonomous vehicles come into common use, you won't need these garages. And so you don't want to build a structure out of concrete and then have to take it down in 20 years' time. So how do you ensure that when you build it today for some use, it can be repurposed as something else? So we say flat floors, certain loadings, and certain slab-to-slab heights to ensure that building can be used later on. And we know that autonomous vehicles are coming, and it will change what we're doing dramatically. I would recommend to you the Conference Board of Canada's, I think it's January 15, report on autonomous vehicles, and I quote from their summary. They say that the change to autonomous vehicles will be as significant to our society as it was going from the horse and buggy to the automobile. So how do you plan for that and yet still look after today's marketplace? So that's what the challenge of some of the waterfront work. We also, with help from OPG, basically devised a carbon tool. That's a software product that allows us and our planners to look at how do we plan the neighborhoods and reduce the carbon use. So that was used in the West Don lands and produced a 29% saving in carbon emissions. We also know that we have all kinds of bad soil down there. I mean, you name a contaminant, and I can find it for you down there. Radioactive, arsenic, cadmium, lead, we got it. We got it all. So the question is, how do we approach that? Normally developers do what we call dig and dump. They dig it out, take it up north, put it in the field, in a licensed facility, but we don't think it's the perfect answer, obviously. So we said, okay, how do we now, since we control 2,000 acres, how are we going to make sure that we can deal with this issue? Because we know every site that they dig up, there's going to be bad soil. So we did 2 pilot runs. We had 2 companies, one from Holland, one from Belgium, come in and basically run a pilot program at our expense to see if you could actually wash it and treat it. We found that you could. So then we basically said, okay, well, how are we going to make sure this gets done in a way that doesn't create a draw on the public purse? And we don't have money to run these kinds of operations. Our funding came in the way of capital grants. But we needed an operator to basically run this and be able to support an operating loss if he had one in a year. So we brought in a private sector operator, and gave them the business, said, okay, there's the business, and what we'll do is we'll guarantee you a feedstock. We'll ensure that every developer who buys land from us has to bring his fill to you, provided that it's no more expensive than dig and dump. So therefore, we directed the flow of earth to that operator, but at no cost to the public. And that's always been our sort of message. How do we get this stuff done without just writing a check for it? And so that now is operating, and the one challenge, of course, with that is the output of that isn't always recognized by governments as clean enough for various uses. So there's regulatory changes that have got to happen to make sure that that becomes a more popular use. We also know that in Toronto, street trees last an average of 6 to 7 years, and then they die and they're chopped off and forgotten about. And we just didn't feel that was appropriate for what we were doing in the waterfront. We want our trees to look like the ones in the main street of Aix-en-Provence, where the plane trees go up 70 feet and provide this great canopy. So we did some research, and we decided to put the trees that I would call generational trees in the public realm in what are called silvacells. And it's a grillage of steel and fiberglass that will actually support traffic loads afterwards. But what it allows for is every tree will have 30 cubic meters of undisturbed soil in which its roots can spread. And also, as you see here, on permeable paving, so it'll get irrigated. So, and the trees that have been planted this way are just doing phenomenally well. It's amazing to see how they're catching on. We're going to be planting about 35,000 trees in the waterfront, and about 16,800 of them will be put into arrangements like this to ensure that, in fact, they grow long term. They don't end up like the sticks sitting up on Spadina Avenue. So one of the other things we wanted to do was put in early transit. We've done our planning so that nobody really is more than a 5-minute walk, about 300 meters away from a transit stop. We know that from anecdotal evidence that if you can put it in early, before people establish their habits, you can change the modal split. Hammarby Sjöstedt in Stockholm, they put the transit in within 18 months of the first occupants, and the modal split went from the mid-30s to the mid-70s to using public transit. So we know that works. The challenge, of course, is it's very, very expensive to build down here, and we're still struggling with that. So I won't call it one of my failures yet, but it's still a struggle because of the funding for transit is political, very political. We're also building future-ready infrastructure. This is a park in West Don Lands called Corktown Common, but really, functionally, it's what we call a flood protection landform. You can't build dikes or engineered structures to withstand flooding in Ontario. You have to use permanent structures. And we have to build flood protection that will accommodate a Hurricane Hazel type storm in the Don River watershed. So the Hurricane Hazel occurred in the Humber, and we're over to a little further to the east, and that's the Don River watershed. So we have to provide this structure. Now, unfortunately here, what we didn't realize initially was where this landform is going to go is actually where the old river used to wind. Because right now, you don't see it behind that sticky label there, is an engineered channel that runs down to the harbor, built in 1910. But the old riverbed is under that landform. And we found out that there's up to 40 feet thick of peat, compressible peat, there that we had to cover. So what we did is we had to surcharge it, and we had to compress it over a 6-month period as opposed to a 20-year period. So we put a surcharge on, but what we did is drill down holes about 35 feet on a 1 meter grid, put a roll of filter fabric down that hole, sand blanket on top, and then the surcharge. So the intent was to squeeze it like a sponge so water would come up and outside, and it would accelerate the compression of the underlying peat. And it worked over 6 months. But we had to drill 30,000 holes. So that was about a year's work. That was very expensive and very time-consuming, as you can imagine. So we've also done some creative things, something that Mr. Adjeleian might have appreciated. Here we've mixed public art, infrastructure, and parks and recreation. So we have in this park called Sherburne Common a collection area. We bring in the storm water. We bring the storm water into big pits that are here, We run it in the basement of that building there, which is here. We run it, we pipe it up to some public art arms, which I will show you later, down into a biofilter here, and then out into an artificial creek that runs out into the harbor. So the stormwater goes out into the harbor about 99% pure. And we don't have stormwater, we use lake water and just treat it and run it through. So it's an interesting aspect where we combine public art, infrastructure, and parks and recreation. We also have a mandate to provide affordable housing. We can't provide the actual housing, but we provide the land for it. So our mandate is that in the waterfront overall, there should be 25% affordability. So 5% low end of market and 20% affordable rental. And that's a real challenge in Canada. I mean, we don't have the national programs and so forth. And we know that even with free land, the calculation we did way back when was it was going to require another $200,000 a door subsidy to put in the actual housing. So it's been very difficult, but we've been fortunate. I must say we've had opportunistic things happen that allowed us to maintain that 20% credit. We've also put in smart infrastructure. Part of our employment strategy was to bring down 40,000 jobs to the waterfront. And up until that time, until about 2005, we did 10 years of development out by the 407. In fact, in 10 years, there was 11 million square feet of office space built on the 407 and only 500,000 downtown. Because the tax structure was very, very onerous, very geared against commercial versus residential. So the jobs were disappearing. So we looked at other examples. In fact, started this in 2004 at the Intelligent Community Forum in New York. Glasgow won the Intelligent Community of the Year. They had basically gone from an unemployment rate of 17% when they lost their shipbuilding down to about 4% by adopting this kind of strategy, becoming an intelligent community. So we went through an RFP and we brought in a carrier. In this case, it was Beanfield, Metro Connect, and basically have provided Canada's first open access ultra broadband. First in Canada, second in North America after Chattanooga. Any carriers can go on, universities can go on, it's open access. I mean, you have to pay a fee, but it's open access. And how we did this was we basically asked the developers to pay a per door fee, and we provided a capital subsidy to Beanfield for the capital construction of the network. And that has worked out fairly well. But part of the deal they got is, if we gave them that, they had to commit, and for every condo building that's in our sort of purview, they had to make sure they were in the top 7 of the world when it came to price performance. I mean, in Canada, we do not do well when it comes to price of our broadband. I mean, it's way up there. We've slipped in our innovation index, where I think we're now like 34 after Romania. And part of it's because broadband's expensive. So in this particular case, he started off at 50 megabits per second, synchronous, same speed up and down, no data caps for $60 a month. But in keeping with the world, he's now at 1 gigabyte per second, synchronous, so same speed up and down, no data caps for $60 a month. And you don't get that anywhere else in North America. And we're using that as part of our strategy for employment. But we also are very careful. We want to ensure that the 20% of affordable housing, how do we look after them? Because the economic divide is getting worse and worse as time goes on. And digital technology may make that worse. So we're trying to find a way to make sure that nobody gets left behind. So what we've done is basically, if I give Beanfield Metro Connect 100 units of value to do it, I ask the market developer to give me 120 units per door. So I transfer and I give Beanfield 100 units for every door. So he wires up everybody, so no one gets left behind, which is really important. And in fact, they've gone even further. They actually offer a discount now on the actual operating fee to those particular affordable units. So again, making sure that the children that grow up there have the same opportunities as everyone in the community. We also are launching an innovation center. We did this through a bit of an RFP for an option. We basically went to the marketplace and said we want to build a innovation center, but you can basically submit your RFP, but you don't need to actually commit until we get anchor tenants. And so Menkes, a local developer, won that. And he's now, I won it about 3 years ago, but he's just now coming to the point where he's got an anchor tenant and prepared to move on with that. And the intent is really to build an innovation corridor that goes from the innovation center at the foot of Jarvis over to Pinewood Studio, over in Commissioners Road, over in the Portlands. And so the intent there is to create that corridor, provide housing that has ultra-high speed broadband so that employees can actually work from home at the same speed they can work at the office. Excuse me. We're also leading our revitalization with great parks and public spaces. I mean, when you think of cities around the world, what really defines them as great cities is the public realm. Not so much the buildings, it's the public realm, the things you experience walking around the city. If you're in Paris, you love, Luxembourg Gardens and the broad streets that Haussmann put in. So we decided to lead that, and for three good reasons. One, huge public cynicism. Let's give some payback to the citizens early on, right away. Secondly, if we build great parks, we know that developers who buy land next door will take advantage of that and build great buildings. So part of it is sort of setting the design excellence standard that we want in the waterfront. And lastly, of course, if our business model is to sell land next door for profit to reinvest, why not add value first? So that's worked out quite well, actually. We've had the funds to do it, and it's actually increased the value of neighboring land significantly. We've also learned some lessons in looking at waterfronts around the world. We ensure now that every park edge or water's edge, we do not allow residential at ground floor. You can have residential above, but at ground floor, if you put residential in, what happens is it unofficially privatizes public space. The condo planters creep out and the patio chairs. And in fact, in looking at cities around the world, I can think of Malmo in Sweden and London on the Thames River, it doesn't work for the residents and doesn't work for the public. I mean, the residents complain about the public walking by and the public are intimidated. You're not going to sit down and watch the water when 4 feet behind you is someone's picture window. So that was a key learning that we picked up in looking at waterfronts around the world that we've put into place along a park edges or along water's edge. We also want to maintain waterfront views as best we can. So the buildings stagger up from the waterfront, 4 to 6 stories at the water's edge, 10 stories at Queens Quay Boulevard, and then against the Gardner, probably up to 30 or more. So again, making sure we have views for everybody and providing views down the lanes and the streets to the waterfront. We've also tried some other creative stuff. We've adopted this street typology called a woonerf, it's a Dutch term. It means living street. And what it means here is that unlike Ontario, where if you're driving your car and it's black tarmac and you got the right of way, that's your area and the sidewalk is somebody else's. In the living street concept, nobody has any right of way. There's no signage. So pedestrians, bicyclists, cars, all mix. Everybody has to look after everybody else. And so it slows things down. And we've used it in some of our back lanes in the West Donlands. So there's no curb. Oh, there is a slight rolled curb because the CNIB had a problem with no curb. They need a visual, not a visual, a tactile edge. But we tried this. And the thing we learned is that in order for something like this to go ahead, you got to call it a pilot project. You can't convince governments to do stuff unless they have to have permission to fail. So a pilot gives them permission to fail. Yeah, it was only a pilot anyways, so it doesn't work, so what? Anyways, this case here, we've tried it as a pilot, and I think we'll see a greater adoption of that over time. And the intent here really was to use permeable pavement to reduce stormwater runoff. So of course the pavers are all pedestrianized pavers. So it creates a pedestrianized environment, but it supports vehicular traffic, but it also is supposed to let the water go through. But anyhow. Oh yes, we've also taken advantage of some space that the space under the overpasses, which if you recall your Grimm's fairy tales, this is where the trolls used to live. Anyways, what we've done is use some of those spaces and created great recreational parks for the citizens. So this one here is under the Richmond-Adelaide flyover, the ramp. So we've put public art in there, put playground in there, and make it well lit, and it becomes a connector piece between two neighborhoods. So it's worked out really, really well. But again, it's using space that otherwise would be dead space. We also have a large public art program. Now, I know in Ottawa, municipal works give 1% of the hard cost to public art. In Toronto, it's the developers have to give 1% of their hard cost towards public art. And quite often what happens is it's a statue in the back corner of the building or something in the lobby. It's not really that visible. The buildings would be smaller, so it's sized to the 1% of that building cost. What we have done with the city's help is said, okay, look, why don't we create a neighborhood art program? We'll front end it and provide the commissions and build more prominent commissions in more prominent public places. But then through the city, we collect the 1% from the developers as they bring their buildings on stream. So basically it allows us again to provide a much more prominent public art program with a theme at no public cost. I mean, yes, there's a cost to administer it on our staff, but really the capital is all provided by the 1% levy that the city insists on from the developers. So it's worked out quite well. So we have a program for West Don Lands. This is one of the more prominent pieces, and a scheme for the East Bay front as well. But again, we'll front it, but it gets paid back by through the developer levies. So that kind of talks about how we do stuff. So we've tried to create some creative ways of building infrastructure. So when you look at what we've done, and again, I mentioned your bearings there before. So 25 new or improved parks, very important because that is what defines a great city. So here's the East Bayfront, which was the precinct closest to the downtown. And here's kind of a before and after shot. This is Sherburne Common. And this is the public art that I mentioned to you as part of the creative infrastructure with the stormwater treatment. So the water gets piped up here and down this metal mesh into a pool, and then through a biofilter, and then in a creek into the harbor. And we also have used that as a skating pond. Part of that is a skating pond in the wintertime, which is very popular in Toronto. It doesn't hold a candle to the Rideau Canal, but we do what we can. This is Sugar Beach. That was quite controversial. We had a few people who weren't friends of the corporation who made a stink about this because of the cost, but it was a reasonable cost when you consider all the things that went into it. This is again across from the sugar factory, so it's called Sugar Beach, and the umbrellas there's fiberglass formed the color of cotton candy, and the sand is the white sugar color, and there's rocks in there that have been brought down and striped as rock candy. So it's all a takeoff on the sugar across the way. Chorus Entertainment's in there as well. About 1,200 employees. Chorus is a vertically integrated broadcaster. They basically create content, and they own radio stations and TV stations and so forth. So their head office is down there with 1,200 employees. Was a first kickoff. George Brown. If you want to animate a waterfront in the wintertime, which is very difficult, one of the secrets is to bring down a college, because the students got to be there in January. So it may seem unfair. I canvassed every college president and university president within a 50-mile radius to entice them down. And they all thought it was a great idea until I looked at it and thought, wait a second, that's a satellite campus now. That's going to have separate costs. So the one we got to eventually to agree was George Brown, who were 3 blocks up the street. They have an urban campus, so for them it was great. And their first healthcare faculty went there. They're building another faculty next door in the near future. We also have Mon Condominiums designed by Moshe Safdie, the architect, famous Canadian architect who designed Habitat in Montreal. And we've got Bayside, Toronto. That's about a 2,000 unit complex, about 500,000 square feet of office space in there. And we went out to the world in this one because we wanted a developer that knew how to mix residential, commercial, and retail. And Canada's got some great developers, and they're usually office or retail or residential. But we wanted someone who knew how to build a mix. So we went out to the entire marketplace, had interest from Ireland, from England, Australia. The eventual winner was Heinz Corporation out of Texas. And they've teamed up with Tridel, who's a local builder, for the residential part. But they're doing a fantastic job down there now, building, I think they're up to about 1,500 units. And that's how it should look probably in another 5 or 10 years. The other neighborhood is West Don Lands. Before, pretty, we leveled everything there. It was all scrub buildings. Here's the park I referred to, using the overpass as a free roof. And Corktown Common. This is the eventual 17-acre park that sits on top of the flood protection landform I described to you earlier on. So rather than take the surcharge away, we just resculpted it and reshaped it and made a phenomenal park. And you would not know that that's all man-made. There's ducks in there now and frogs and, about 3,000 trees and bushes. It's quite a phenomenal park. And that's the pavilion at the top of the park, playground for the kids. And our first private sector developer, Urban Capital, who do work here in Ottawa and Montreal, their first project was River City Condominiums in West Don Lands. And we also had the Toronto Community Housing Corporation pony up some money to build about 200 units of affordable rental in the same area, which was fortuitous for us because we know we have a challenge in paying for affordable housing. We also were fortunate as a city to win the Pan Am Games for 2015. So we teamed up with Infrastructure Ontario and put a bid out, and the winners were Dundee Kilmar, a joint venture, and Ellis Don. And basically, they built a number of units to house the athletes there in exchange for getting land, other land that's there as well. So they built those and very successful. And this is called now the Distillery District, and it's a very successful area. And it also includes 2 affordable housing buildings provided by the province. One is run by Fred Victor, and one is with Indigenous people, it's Wigwamum. So we're keeping up with our 20% affordable rental through good luck mainly, but that's fine. So this is what the neighborhood will look like as it's finished. So this is River City, TCHC here, and the Pan Am Village is here, and this is all yet to be built. Central Waterfront, we initially thought there wasn't much work to do there, but then we looked at it and thought it's pretty grim. We spent some money revitalizing around Harbourfront Centre on York Quay, basically putting in boardwalks, finger piers, upgrading the surfacing, and so forth. And eventually put an underground parking garage there so we could take back the surface parking here and build public realm, but still maintain the revenue for Harbourfront Centre. Because that's been a struggling place. It's a cultural center. They do a great job, but they run it on a knife edge, and they need the revenue. So we built Ontario Square by the street. You can imagine who funded that. And Canada Square by the water. And those 2 pieces of public realm were built on the old parking lot next to Harbourfront Centre. So one of the big projects we had, which I thought was going to be a real sort of page turner for us, was the revitalization of Quay Boulevard itself. Quay Boulevard was voted as one of the 10 ugliest streets in North America on a spacing blog. And I would say it's an accolade that was well earned. I mean, it was very appropriate. It was awful. It was a 4-lane road, but effectively you had, ice cream vendors, school buses, illegal taxis illegally parking. It was really 2 lanes, and not very good 2 lanes at that. So we said, we're going to convert it to 2 lanes, but provide facilities for all the things that need to be there, like taxi stands, lay-bys, those kinds of things. So we converted it. This is what it looked like afterwards. It was about $130 million to do. Very expensive, because you put a light pole in, it's on a 35-foot caisson. So it's very, very expensive to build down there, but a very successful project. And I'm going to ask Ethan to press the button. Ethan, would you start that video? This is the fly-through that we did, and I'm proud to say that just about everything that's shown here has been built. The trees aren't as big as shown here, but not yet, but they will be. So this shows a fly down through the new tramway. Again, a new street typology, the tram's not in the center. It's on the side, because we wanted to see a more pedestrian environment. And that took a year of arguing just to get that through the city. And then our Martin Goodman Trail, which is a trail that runs along the waterfront that basically is for bicycling, rollerblading, skateboarding, and running. Our new streetcars. Again, flying over Ontario Square and Canada Square by Harbourfront Centre. And it pretty much looks like that now, apart from the fact that trees aren't as big. And we don't have as many finger piers yet out, but we have a couple. So let's talk about the numbers. I think Paul mentioned we spent $1 billion. Actually, we had invested about $1.3 billion in 2013. We said, well, let's do a check here. We're halfway through our mandate. We only have a 20-year mandate. So in 2013, we're half the way through. Let's look at what we spent, how we invested it, and what have the results been. So we looked at that time, almost $1.3 billion investment that we had provided. And we saw it had generated $622 million worth of government revenues. That's direct taxes, indirect taxes, and induced taxation. And that's, this is obviously very self-serving, fine, but we had to do it to look at what had been done. And I think it's a model that Stats Canada used. So we'd used the government's own model to do it. We didn't cook something up here on our own. We actually had a credible model. But that's our investment, but we brought the private sector in. So the first 6 projects generate $2.6 billion of investment privately, and that generates another $838 million of government revenue. So that's pretty significant. And people tell us, in our property and outside our property, because of what we're doing, we've actually been a catalyst for many, many developments in the waterfront, kind of 44 of them. Now, we can't take credit and say that they're all there just because of us, but some of the big ones are. We either in part promoted it or we actually helped them market and so forth. But that $9.6 billion generates another $3.4 billion of government revenue. So the initial investment of seed capital really is paying back, many times over for the government. So we've come a long way, but work's not finished. So what's next? Well, the Portlands is next. That's about 850 acres of the 2,000 that is under flood risk. So you can't do anything down there until you solve the flood issue. And that's the next area of development. So people say, why do you spend the money down there? Well, the result is, under the provincial plan, you've got to intensify. We can't keep building bungalows to Niagara Falls. That's just not going to work. So you've got to find a way to intensify. And this is the next location for the city to grow. So I talked about flood protection before. And the Corktown Common Flood Protection Landform is right there, and that provides flood protection for all of that area there. Goes right, there'll be there'll be water in the lobby of BC Place or Brookfield Place if that wasn't there during a Hurricane Hazel type storm. So that's been done. So the next phase is to look after all this area here. It goes up into Riverdale, Leslieville and Riverdale, and so this is the area we're working in to solve the issue. And we launched an environmental assessment. It took 10 years to do it, all the modeling and public consultation and political consultation. And this is looking at Hurricane Hazel in the Don River watershed. That's about 36,000 hectares. And you can see from the slides here, the difference between 1990 and 2005 of hard surfaced area, which makes runoff even worse. And of course, can't imagine what it would be in 2015. It'd be much worse, I'm sure. So that's a huge, huge issue. And if you look at the Hurricane Hazel situation in the Don River watershed, it's going to generate almost 2,000 cubic meters per second at the peak. Niagara Falls, Canadian and American together, only generates 3,000 meters per second. So 2/3 of the water of Niagara Falls is going to come down that river and try and do a 90-degree right turn. Well, that's not going to work. So what's the answer? Well, we looked at it. So we had to respond. This is the existing condition, which shows the Don River coming down and turning right in the Keating Channel. The solution really is to redirect the river, make it a much more naturalized river, and come through the middle of the Portlands out into the harbor. But also, even that won't accommodate it. Also, you actually have a spillway now. So the main channel provides most of the day-to-day water flow, but in the flood condition, you have a weir here which will allow water to come out the Keating Channel and out into the ship channel as well. So you have 3 outlets for the water to ensure that the flooding doesn't back up into the surrounding urban areas. And this allows you then to develop the Portlands, both with residential and office, of course. So the 3-tier system, this shows you the 3 outlets for the water, the primary channel, the secondary channel, and the tertiary channel. And then this shows how we'll build in the urban fabric around the flood protection. Because one of the objectives of the environmental assessment wasn't just to solve the flooding, it was to try to naturalize the river as well, to make it an asset. It should be one of the jewels of the harbor as opposed to what it is now as really a drain channel. It's pretty grim. So this again was designed to ensure that we could actually use the flood areas as parkland as well. And of course build in around with them the residential and office. And you'll see probably what will happen is towards the west end, which is the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see probably higher density residential, retail. And as you move across over to this area here, over here, it'll convert to commercial, more employment uses, because at the far side, outside the slide, you have the sewage plant, and you have, you know, all kinds of things like that that aren't going to change. So you'll see, I think, a slide from residential over to more industrial uses over the 850 acres. So I'm going to, Ethan, you want to pull the trigger on that one, please? This is a fly-through of the New River. Here's the Keating Channel where it turns right now. So this is all the New River. So the Prime Minister Trudeau and Premier Wynne and Mayor Tory announced on June of 2017 an additional $1.25 billion to do this work. This is probably about a 7-year project. It's a very extensive, very expensive and extensive, but we had been after them for probably 5 years. I mean, a few years when I was there, but the political stars have to align. And so they finally did, and they provided funding for that. And so that project now has started, and that'll be about a 7-year project to do that. But it'll free up that area. So this is kind of a view of the waterfront, probably in 10, 15 years' time. To the left is kind of Young Street, and we're swinging over to the right to Parliament and beyond. And the new Portlands with the New River. That'll be fantastic. So what else has happened since I left? Waterfront Toronto decided to go out and search for an innovation partner. You probably heard about Google being down there. Well, Sidewalk Labs, which is a subsidiary of Alphabet, which also owns Google, responded to an RFP that Waterfront Toronto put out looking for an innovation partner. And that was really to help them try to, again, create the city of the future, move things forward. And Sidewalk Labs won the RFP. And they, I think, are seen as a very credible partner in that area. They're very much urban thinkers. Dan Doctoroff, who is the CEO of Sidewalk Labs, was the former deputy mayor under Mayor Bloomberg in New York. And he's done a lot of urban improvements and so forth. So he's headed up Sidewalk Labs. And I think the term they use is looking for sort of an urban development, urban planning moonshot. Like, how do they move things way ahead? Not just incrementally, but how do they really move things ahead? So they stepped up to the plate. And the challenge really is, no one knows yet what the partnership is or what the model is. They said that they would spend a year with Waterfront Toronto. They would invest $50 million US in trying to look at how it goes through and how they can help Waterfront Toronto really build a city. They have closely aligned objectives. They both want, you know, globally significant demonstration project, all those good stuff that we believe in. So they're very much aligned. And the framework agreement they've struck really has them working with Waterfront Toronto for about a year, investing $50 million US in projects to see how they can come up with a model to basically move them forward. Hopefully they would use the Waterfront Toronto model as an example to promote their systems around the world. To hear him talk, he would say that he chose Waterfront Toronto because it's really the only project of that kind of scale that can provide the room to do the sorts of things that they want to do. Everything else is kind of building by building, where this is a massive scale. So they're quite keen to make it work. And jury's out. We'll have to see what happens after a year, what they do. So I would argue that we are delivering on the promise of the waterfront. It's coming along, and I would encourage you to look at Waterfront Toronto's website. All the information is there. And I'll open the floor to questions. Sir.
Have you followed the future of the idea of creating that mixed-use pedestrian street in the pilot project? Because I know what happened at the Lansdowne project here in Ottawa, the streets were originally designed to be that way. However, after less than 1 year, there were the manager of the site then painted lines and stop signs all over the property and returned it to, and then started to enforce a regular traffic and pedestrian flow on the site. Yeah. Are you worried about that happening?
Yeah, sure, we are. Because, I mean, operationally, things are difficult. And one of the challenges we had with that particular concept was we had the operations people saying, well, the snow plows are going to catch the edge and dig it up. It doesn't work. So we've had the pavers today, penalty pavers, both locked this way and this way. So it avoids a lot of the problems with the snowplow. But yes, it's a challenge because the operations people are struggling, as they always do. I mean, most urban centers in Canada are underfunded because we have a funding structure designed in 1867. So all you got is property tax and fees and so forth. So most urban centers, including Toronto, are struggling for revenue. So they have a challenge. So they don't like things that are non-standard. So it took us probably 6 months of arguing to get that done, even calling it a pilot. And we faced the same issues. We tried to at first start to put pavers in at crosswalks. They wanted paint. So it's a challenge. So your point's well taken, and there isn't an answer to it. I'm worried about it. Sure, I'm worried about it, but we just have to keep pushing, keep plugging. I mean, it's you know, in getting back to something Paul said about a comment I made earlier on, I follow, you know, to be successful, I have to follow 3 Ps. You got to have a sense of purpose, you got to have passion for it, and you got to have patience. And particularly patience is an essential element because you just got to keep at it. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Glenn Milne. I'm lucky enough to be the last remaining founder of the School of Architecture here at Carleton. I was the chairman of an urban assistance task force in the early 70s. I was Prime Minister Trudeau the first urban design advisor, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we need a balanced response in our minds to what you've presented. I'm blown. I bet you're a great golfer too.
No, I'm not. But
that's one of the best presentations I've ever seen in my life. But there are a couple of key notes that I can't help but sort of listen for, and you hit a few of them. One was 330,000 people a year being imported into Canada, and we get 40% of them. Another was we can't just keep building bungalows, we have to intensify. I would ask everybody in the audience just to slow down a second and say, you know, what is this growth for? What kind of life for the individuals in those high-rise comes from this kind of development? If you zoom in on one of those families in one of those high-rise, their connection to the world is Wi-Fi, television, an elevator, and we know, research a long time ago in the 60s, that anything more than 250 people in a building, it's a building full of strangers. You didn't mention schools. You didn't mention, you didn't build what you're building by following the life of a child and seeing what they need as they go along. And most of us have visited Toronto and gone down to that area and been awestruck by the quality of what you've done as a type of thing. But I'd just ask everybody here to slow down a bit and to ask themselves, what type of city is being built there? And I say that with reflection on, living in Helsinki, living in Stockholm, living in places where, a high-rise in Helsinki is 6 stories and not 7, because a mother on the 6th floor can see the expression on the face of a child in the sandlot behind the building. So to just start that wave going through your mind, please, as opposed to just being, swept away by scale. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Those are very good points you raise, and I didn't dwell on some of the points to address that, and I'll mention them now, though, because one of the things we are trying to do is ensure that the waterfront is built for future family life. The model of people in their 20s working and living downtown, then they go to their family formation years, move to the burbs, and then when they hit 55, they come back. That's not sustainable long term. So one of our goals is to try to provide a type of city life that in fact allows people to grow their families there. So, for example, in our planning, 30% of all land is green space. That's a minimum, that should be 30%. We try to make housing size flexible. Schools, both school boards are given options on land, so they come in and say, okay, we may want a school eventually, so we want to put an option on that piece of land. So we have lots dedicated to future schools. And I think the quality of schools isn't an issue in Ontario because we have a central funding body that basically makes sure that you don't have poor schools and rich schools. You basically have Ontario grade schools. So I think we're feeling comfortable about the school situation. The 6 stories versus 30, I tend to agree. We've tried to encourage our developers to build more family units on grade. So there's actually access at ground level for that. But you raise interesting challenges, which we've tried to face in our way, but not perfect answers, I'm sure. But thank you for raising it. My professor.
Thank you.
This gentleman was my professor many years ago. You look the same.
Now you are more than a professor.
Yeah.
At the outset, if you hear some noises from my neck, popping noises, it's because I'm recovering from a neck injury, but I don't have a pain in the neck, and also there's no pleasure in popping, and so on. It's good to see you here. I think that we would like to get more visits from you, in particular to the classroom, if at all you have time for it, because what you have presented here is textbook material, is something that should be practiced, that should be in the books, it should be taught at the school level. Otherwise, what we are teaching here is nowhere close to what you have. Last Monday, as a part of some sabbatical activities, I was visiting Harvard University School of Graduate Studies, and they have a program called ZOFNES. They developed the Envision Sustainability Rating Method or framework, and they have 64 criteria so that they can judge projects in terms of whether they are meeting sustainability criteria or not. Now I know, after hearing you, as to why there are 64. How many things have you presented here that we should pay attention to? Yeah. So I thank you very much for presenting this one here. Now I have some requests, some views, and that is that, do you have a message for academic institutions such as Carleton in terms of how we expose civil engineers to projects of this particular type, in particular opportunities whereby we can go beyond simply brick and mortar and to bring in sustainability factors which are present-day concerns, sustainability and resilience. So what should we do? What should be done so that we have ample opportunities for these new graduates to soak up knowledge? This is one question. Second one, that if you did not have a business case, you would not have this project. Now, how can we teach our young graduates that they have to pay attention to whatever they can to build up their knowledge base in terms of how one can make a business case for making a project of this particular type to be a reality? So there are two questions here.
Well, the first question, my answer to that is, you're already doing it. I'm actually stunned when Paul gave me a tour this afternoon to see how much intermingling there is between the disciplines. So I think Paul is the chair, it's civil engineering and sustainability and environmental. So I walked around and saw the posters. You're already merging the disciplines much more. When I went to school with you, I think your course was the one sort of that was on the fringe, urban planning, but everything else was strictly engineering. But it seems to be a much broader curriculum now. So I think you're already doing that. And I can't think of any other suggestion other than to invite industry people in to the class. Like I speak at the University of Toronto occasionally at the graduate planning course, and I'm a visiting fellow at Ryerson. But so that sort of stuff I think is useful to bring people in from the outside, to have the students exposed to the real world that way. Your comment about the business case, I think I'm not sure how you impress in students who've never worked before, who've never been in business or business environment, the necessity of a business case, other than to sort of stress the fact that having great dreams is wonderful, but they're just dreams unless you can make them happen. And making them happen means you got to figure out, where the money comes from. And yes, we were very fortunate. We got $1.5 billion of commitments, but we've shown that it earns money. So I don't have a perfect answer for your second question. I think that's beyond my scope. How do you get the kids to think about business terms? Sorry, I have no suggestions for you on that one.
Yes. I'm just going to sit here and one of the things that we've got a project, of course, at Lansdowne Park, and one of the struggles that seems to have come about is the space in between the developments. Developers build buildings, cities build streets. The interconnectivity between the two is lacking. And it's lacking big time. And I mean just simple things like canopies and definitions of path and place. I wonder if within your criteria, whether you set out strategies for that.
Yeah, I think the advantage we had, because we were in control of 2,000 acres and not a bunch of building sites, basically we could control everything. So the public realm was designed to make sure everything connected well. And I would say that we probably spent more time fussing about the public realm than we did about the buildings. So the buildings were done by developers. They would buy land from us. And they were not selected, by the way, just on price. They were selected on price. That was 40% of points. The rest was on design quality, sustainability, community vision, et cetera. So we picked developers who sort of bought into the vision. But we focused our attention on the public realm, the connectivity between those buildings. And that was a big issue. The other thing as well, it's unfortunate sometimes. I was at a meeting this morning with the mayor of Vaughan City and made the comment that, unfortunately, building codes and zonings define the basics, the minimums, as opposed to the aspirational level. And I don't think cities are creative enough in raising the standards a bit on their building codes and zoning regulations. I mean, they have to be careful, because you do too much, you kill the development. But you can edge it up and ask for things that I think aren't currently in the Ontario Building Code. I know in talking to the chief planner of Toronto regarding our waterfront plan of making sure that residential buildings can be redemised, he's going to try and put that in the next building code in Ontario. So I don't know in your particular project an answer to that, but I think one of the advantages of having a master planner for the area is to focus on those connections and in-between spaces, as you call them, as opposed to developers plunking down buildings and then the city putting a street through and then that's it? No, that's not good enough.
Are there any plans for allotment gardens or any way of people experiencing, dirt, plants, tomatoes?
There are allotment gardens at the end of the Portlands already. There's already there. There's been discussions about, do we do more of that? And there's nothing allocated yet. I mean, I would say the allotment gardens typically end up being in leftover space. And currently, that space is over by the sewage plant in Toronto on Leslie Street. So there's been talk about rooftop gardens, because the green roofs are designed for intensive use as opposed to extensive use. So you should be...
About a 5-year-old be able to walk out the door on her own and go to the garden and fuss about and come back home, which of course is at the other end of the spectrum of the kind of building you're doing.
Someone under her hand up here.
Yeah,
Sir.
Okay. So you kind of described some challenges with the city.
3.
So what kind of relationship do you have with the city? So you have official plan, secondary plan, and when you're trying to promote the very progressive or innovative, how did you develop that? How did you get?
This is the part where I asked not to videotape this thing. It's interesting, very interesting. We're the child of 3 governments, so we have a board of directors and a chair, and there's 4 directors appointed by the city, 4 from the feds and 4 from the province, and a chair that's agreed upon by all 3 of them. And that's what really drives the ship, so to speak, from a governance point of view. I would say all governments have been very supportive, and I've been through 3 prime ministers, 3 premiers, and 3 or 4 mayors, and everyone that comes to power says, those last guys were bums. We're going to do better for you, and we're going to help you more. Now, the challenge really is at the operational level, as this gentleman pointed out, is that, cities are not well funded, and they don't, the chief of infrastructure doesn't want to see oddball stuff happening, and I'm sure they get snake oil salesmen coming every day with new ideas, so they're not really keen to take on new issues. That's why we sort of call them pilots. But yeah, it's a challenge to overcome some of that. I spent 3 months arguing about whether we could put paving stones on crosswalks as opposed to painted lines. When NERFs were put in, finally they agreed to let us put a NERF in as long as we put it on a solid concrete base. Like, so much for permeable pavement. So there are funny things that happen, but I would say that all governments have been supportive. It just becomes a challenge sometimes when you're trying to do something new that people are nervous about it. And so they become pilots until they prove themselves in.
So you get to spend those 2 days at plan committee trying to convince councillors?
Well, but usually when we have the public consultation process, we're almost arm in arm with the city planners anyway. So it's not, we don't spring it on them. The plans get developed over a long period of time, through consultation process. We actually invented a new process where we have a public meeting, and then we have a stakeholder meeting. So we invite probably a dozen stakeholders from that community, people who represent organizations, in to sit down with our planners and actually do the work, roll their sleeves up and help do the work. Then we have a public meeting and show that to the public, go back with the stakeholders, go back to the public, and then go on to council. So by the time we go to council, and the city planners are aware of all this and involved in all this as well. So by the time we get to council, we have a plan that really represents everyone's interests. So we have a lot of consensus at that point in time. I mean, it's interesting. I've learned that the old way of a developer presenting a plan saying, here, it's good for you, what I call the decide and defend model, does not work in today's society. Because people object to it. Why? Because they weren't part of the process. So you invite them in, be part of the process, crowdfund ideas, be part of that process. So when you get to the end of the day and you're in front of council, everybody is there saying, yeah, let them get on with it. So it works that way. So we've had to sort of innovate a bit on how we do things, but I would say in all, the government's been very supportive. I mean, they've given us $500 million each to start with, another $1.25 billion for the flood protection. So they've all been very supportive, but mind you, they have constraints too. So, they've got to weigh priorities, and is transit more important than flood protection? So all those things fit into the equation. But overall, I would say our government's been very good. It's a challenge sometimes. Mayor Ford was a challenge.
I've been curious about the climatic conditions in Toronto. How much different are they really from Ottawa? I saw in your whole projection of everything, one picture of winter.
Yeah.
So out of 365 days a year?
Yeah, no, a good point. That's why we got George Brown down there, fill the place with students in January.
Well, all the beauty exemplifications of everything, they're all deciduous trees. I didn't see one coniferous.
No, that's fair enough.
And so the rationale to that, because in winter, here in Ottawa, we do have the pseudo canal, and the coniferous do help a heck of a lot. When I designed my home, I made sure the northwest was all the coniferous and deciduous to the south, southeast. So I'm just curious, like, you had one illustration, that was them skating on that one little pond, when there's 300 miles difference. Is the climate that much? I think they
it is fairly different. It's almost, I live in Collingwood now, so in the winter, if I drive up north, when 410 crosses over Highway 7, the snow appears. And below that, the snow disappears. So it is much milder in Toronto than it is in Ottawa. But it still gets winter. And the challenge is, how do you animate the place in the wintertime when you've got the wind coming off the lake? There are coniferous trees in Canada Square. And there is a mix of trees that the city's asked us to put in because they're concerned about, a plague or something going through and wiping out all one species. So there is a desire to have a mixture of species in the various areas. We try to make the canopies look alike. So you might have a certain species that has a certain canopy and another species that has a similar canopy, but they're different species to avoid, some kind of blight taking them all out at once, or Dutch elm disease, for example. And we are aware. I mean, yes, the pictures show summertime, and winter is there. And that was our concern. How do we animate this place with people walking around in the wintertime? And one of our solutions was to bring down a college or university because it's full of students. They keep it alive. So we are doing what we can do.
Okay, my other question was, again, with the coniferous ideology, your beautiful idea of the playground under the highways, acoustically, I didn't see that much foliage. Maybe I missed it. But the acoustics of hearing this highway around you when you're playing in the little park,
yeah,
that sounds.
We did a lot of acoustic testing for that very reason, to see what would happen down there.
So foliage would have been helpful.
I think it might have been, but I think the concern would have been more at a kid's playground. You don't want places that people can hide or whatever. You want it more open and visible. So it was more of a safety issue.
But the acoustics of the.
They don't see that because you're underneath it, so it's sort of going that way. So it's more of a problem for the buildings we put next door. So we've had to worry about, for example, Toronto Community Housing butts up against that ramp. So we had to worry about how is that building impacted? How is it designed to ensure that the sound from the highway doesn't hit that? So.
Thank you. One last question.
Do you know Ottawa is going through the same process of developing the laboratory flats? And you mentioned that the NCC and Vancouver has the same design review panels. Did your organization have the chance to share some of their experience with the NCC?
I talked to them earlier on, and I think we modeled our design review panel after what they had done here. But I don't think we had a lot of dialogue with them per se about what we were doing. No. We've talked to the developers of Labatt Flats, or down by the water, the windmill people who are also present in Toronto. But as far as the NCC, no. I mean, I think we always thought that they've been great at providing green space along the canals, along public spaces, and every time we come to Ottawa, we admire what's been done. But no, I think our focus is much more on the urban side.
Okay, we have one more question.
Yes, that was so interesting. Thank you so much. And John Adjeleian was my structures teacher back when, so it was really, hi there, Adjeleians. And that was really inspiring. And I was with colleagues at the Toronto Fair, for the University's Fair, and we left the convention center, rented bikes, and rode down there, and it really was impressive. And we all saw how much Toronto had changed. We had not known it to have really be a global city as it is today. But coming back to Glenn's point, I wanted to ask you whether you can imagine a different kind of urbanism that would also beautify and work, but that might be of a different sort, perhaps of a lower scale, more organic, more room for potential unfinishedness, roughness, the natural state of things. Is there such an urbanism that we're thinking about that here in Ottawa with our river and a strong voice wishing it to be left as it is, as a kind of almost a visceral voice of Indigenous presence and memory. And on the other hand, the spectacle, the pressure toward beautiful, tall, spectacle buildings that can sell well. So that's kind of the question I have. Is there another urbanism? And behind and at the pit of this one, what is the fundamental impulse? Is it beautification? Is it Is it the removal of ugliness? Is it provision of more housing? What's the core of the project?
The core is quality of life. It's quality of life, making sure that people want to live here, they want to raise their families here, they want to play here and so forth. That's the issue, is the quality of life. Your question about the new type of urbanism, we looked at, in the Portlands, we looked at initially at sort of a Dutch scheme where you actually had probably two-level and so forth. But the challenge you have is that, like, we're not a Soviet empire kind of thing. The challenge is how do you move along and create great stuff, but still bring the market along with you. Make sure that developers, we're not building the buildings, developers are. And so we're going to build stuff that sells. So the challenge is, you stretch as far as you can towards, great urban solutions, but you got to remind yourself that the people who are actually putting the big money in are developers, and they've got to sell the buildings. Mm-hmm. And so that's a business reality that we have to struggle with. Yes, we'd love to build a visionary city that had no cars and lots of green space and gardens and this and that, but that's a dream. So the reality is our challenge is how do you tactically move towards that, so those visionary things, but at the same time bring the market with you, because they're the ones bringing the dollars, doing the actual work. We're just creating the framework. And yes, we push LEED Gold and we create our minimum green building requirements, but we do it hesitantly to make sure that we're not turning a tap off, because people are going to want to invest money there and buy there. So the challenge is you can't get too far ahead of yourself.
Thank you very much, Dr. Campbell, and please give a round of applause.
Thank you.